The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Isolde Marlow's kitchen, casting dancing patterns across the worn wooden table where she kneaded dough for her daily batch of peach cobbler. At 67, her hands moved with the practiced grace of 4 decades spent running Sweetgrove Bakery, the small artisanal shop that had become the heart of her quiet existence in Millbrook, South Carolina. The scent of magnolias drifted through the open window, mingling with the aroma of cinnamon and vanilla that perpetually clung to her apron. Isolde paused in her work, wiping flour-dusted fingers on the faded cotton fabric as she gazed out at the peach trees that bordered her property. Their blossoms had long since given way to small green fruits, promising another abundant harvest. It had been 3 years since her husband Robert's passing, and she had found solace in the rhythm of her days, rising before dawn to prepare fresh pastries, greeting familiar faces who stopped by for their morning coffee and her famous buttermilk biscuits, then retreating to her garden in the evening to tend the vegetables that reminded her of her grandmother's teachings. The brass bell above her front door chimed, and Isolde glanced at the clock. 7:30 was early, even for her most devoted customers. She dusted her hands and walked through the narrow hallway that connected her kitchen to the shop, where she found Marcus, the postal worker, holding a cream-colored envelope that seemed to shimmer in the morning light. "Morning, Mrs. Marlow," Marcus said, tipping his cap. "Got something special for you today. International mail. Looks fancy." Isolde accepted the envelope with curiosity, noting the elegant script that spelled out her name and the unfamiliar stamps bearing the image of a castle. Her heart gave an unexpected flutter as she recognized the return address: Château de Lys, Kingdom of Virlande. "Thank you, Marcus," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. After he left, Isolde settled into the wooden chair behind her counter, the envelope trembling slightly in her hands. Virlande. She hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in over 40 years, hadn't allowed herself to think of it except in the quiet hours before sleep, when memories crept in unbidden. With careful fingers she broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter within. The letterhead bore an official crest, and the words that followed made her breath catch. "Dear Mrs. Marlow, we are pleased to inform you that your granddaughter, Miss Ilara Marlow, has been selected from among numerous qualified candidates to participate in the prestigious Royal Heritage Restoration Project at Château de Lys. The 6-month position will involve the careful restoration of Renaissance-era portraits in our Royal Gallery, with particular focus on the collection documenting the House of Leclerc. Miss Marlow's portfolio and academic credentials in art conservation have impressed our selection committee. The position includes accommodation, meals, and a generous stipend, as well as the opportunity to work alongside Europe's finest restoration specialists. We understand this opportunity requires significant travel and commitment. Please confirm Miss Ilara's acceptance by return post, along with travel arrangements. The project begins October 15th. Respectfully yours, Dr. Helena Voss, Director of Cultural Heritage, Château de Lys Museum. Isolde's hands shook as she set the letter down. Ilara, her precious granddaughter, 26 years old and brilliant with her artist's eye and gentle heart, was going to Virlande, to the place where Isolde had left a piece of her soul all those years ago. The bell chimed again, and Isolde looked up to see Mrs. Patterson, one of her regular customers, approaching the counter with her usual cheerful smile. "Good morning, dear. I'll have my usual 2 blueberry muffins and a cup of that heavenly coffee you brew." Mrs. Patterson paused, studying Isolde's face. "Are you feeling well? You look quite pale." Isolde forced a smile, carefully folding the letter and slipping it into her apron pocket. "Just a bit tired, that's all. Let me get those muffins for you." As she moved through the familiar motions of serving her customer, Isolde's mind raced. Ilara had mentioned applying for various restoration positions after completing her master's degree, but she had never specifically mentioned Virlande. Perhaps she hadn't realized the significance of the location to her grandmother. After all, Isolde had shared so few details about her year abroad as a young woman. The morning passed in a blur of customers and routine tasks, but the letter seemed to burn against her chest where it rested in her pocket. By noon, when the last customer had departed and she had flipped the sign to closed, Isolde could no longer contain her restless energy. She walked to the small sitting area at the back of her shop, where 2 worn armchairs flanked a bookshelf, filled with her favorite novels and recipe collections. From behind a leather-bound copy of Pride and Prejudice, she retrieved a small wooden box that she hadn't opened in years. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper yellowed with age, lay a miniature portrait painted on ivory, the face of a young man with dark hair and kind eyes, rendered in delicate brushstrokes. Beneath it rested a letter, the envelope bearing her name in elegant script, the wax seal broken long ago. Isolde lifted the portrait with trembling fingers, studying the face that had haunted her dreams for 4 decades. Thorian. She had known him for only one summer, but it had been enough to change the course of her entire life. The letter had arrived 6 months after she'd returned from her cultural exchange program to the United States, 6 months after she'd discovered the truth about his identity and fled Virlanda without a word of goodbye. By then, she had already known about the pregnancy, had already made the difficult decision to raise her daughter alone, rather than complicate his life with scandal. My dearest Isolde, the letter began in his familiar handwriting. I have searched everywhere for you, written to every address I could find, hoping these words might somehow reach you. She had read it countless times over the years, memorizing every word of longing and confusion, every plea for explanation. But she had never replied. How could she explain that she had fallen in love with a university student, named Thorian, only to discover at a public ceremony that he was Prince Thorian of Virlanda, heir to a throne and bound by duties she could never comprehend? Now the sound of footsteps on her front porch drew her back to the present. Through the window, she could see Ilara's familiar silhouette, her strawberry blonde hair catching the afternoon sunlight. "Grandma," Ilara's voice called through the door. "Are you in there? I have the most incredible news." Isolde quickly returned the portrait and led her to their hiding place, smoothing her hair and apron before unlocking the door. Ilara burst in with characteristic enthusiasm, her cheeks flushed with excitement, and her art portfolio bag slung over her shoulder. "You'll never believe it," Ilara began, her words tumbling over each other. "I got the position, the restoration project in Europe, the one I've been dreaming about since graduate school. They want me to work on Renaissance portraits in an actual royal palace." Isolde pulled her granddaughter into a warm embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of her lavender shampoo and trying to steady her racing heart. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Tell me everything." As Ilara launched into an animated description of the opportunity, Isolde found herself studying her granddaughter's features with new eyes, the green eyes that sparkled with intelligence, the determined set of her jaw, the graceful way she moved her hands as she spoke, all inherited from her mother, Sarah, who had died when Ilara was 12. But there, in the tilt of her head and the warmth of her smile, Isolde saw echoes of someone else entirely. "The palace is now a museum," Ilara was saying, "and they're doing a major restoration of the Royal Portrait Gallery. I'll be working specifically on paintings from the 18th and 19th centuries. Grandma, this could make my entire career." "When do you leave?" Isolde asked, though she already knew the answer. "October 15th. I know it's soon, but I couldn't bear to wait. I've already started researching the royal family, the House of Leclerc. There's this fascinating story about a prince who never ruled, who abdicated his claim to marry for love rather than political alliance. It's so romantic." Isolde's breath caught. "What was his name?" "Prince Thorian. He died quite young from what I can gather, but he was apparently beloved by the people. They say he founded several charitable organizations and pushed for democratic reforms before his death. There's something mysterious about his personal life, though, references to a great love that was never publicly acknowledged." The room seemed to spin around Isolde, and she gripped the back of a chair for support. Thorian was gone. The man whose memory had shaped every decision of her adult life, who had unknowingly been the father of her child, was dead. She had lost him twice now, once when she fled Virland, and now to the finality of time itself. "Grandma, are you all right?" Ilara's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Isolde forced herself to focus on her granddaughter's concerned face. "I'm fine, dear. Just overwhelmed by your good news. Have you told your parents yet?" "I called Mum and Dad this morning. They're thrilled, of course, though Mum did worry about me being so far from home for 6 months. Ilara paused, studying her grandmother's face. "Are you sure you're okay? You seem different somehow." "Just tired." Isolde repeated the lie she'd told Mrs. Patterson that morning. "Would you like some tea? I made lemon scones this morning." As she busied herself in the kitchen, Preparing tea and arranging scones on her good china, Isolde's mind whirled with possibilities and fears. Ilara was going to Virlanda, to the very palace where Isolde had spent the most transformative summer of her life. She would walk the same halls, breathe the same air, perhaps even work in the very room where Isolde had first laid eyes on Thorian during a public tour 43 years ago. The irony was not lost on her that Ilara would be restoring portraits of the royal family, including, presumably, images of the man who was her biological grandfather, though she would never know it. "Tell me about the prince," Isolde said as they settled with their tea, hoping her voice sounded casual. "The one who abdicated." Ilara's eyes lit up at the invitation to share her research. Prince Thorian Leclerc, born in 1932, so he would have been in his 20s during the late 1950s, when most of these portraits were painted. He was engaged to Princess Adelaide of Montclair in what was meant to be a political marriage, but the engagement was broken under mysterious circumstances. Some historians suggest he fell in love with someone inappropriate, maybe a commoner or someone from another country. What happened to him? He formally renounced his claim to the throne in 1965 and dedicated his life to charitable work and political reform. He never married, never had children that anyone knows of. He died in the early 1980s, I think. There are rumors that he kept detailed journals, but they've never been made public. Isolde sipped her tea, each piece of information settling like a stone in her chest. Thorian had never married. He had given up his throne, the very obligation that had seemed so insurmountable to her young mind, and he had died alone, never knowing about the daughter he had helped create. During those precious weeks when she had known him simply as a history student, with kind eyes and an infectious laugh. "I should let you rest," Ilara said eventually, noticing her grandmother's growing quietness. "I have so much to prepare before I leave. Passport renewal, visa applications, research." She paused at the door. "Grandma, have you ever been to Europe?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Isolde met her granddaughter's curious gaze and felt the weight of 40 years of carefully guarded secrets. "Once," she said simply, "a very long time ago." After Ilara left, Isolde sat alone in her kitchen as twilight painted the sky purple and gold. The letter from the Chateau de Lille lay open on the table before her, and beside it, the small portrait of Thorian seemed to watch her with those familiar, gentle eyes. A plan began to form in her mind, reckless perhaps, but suddenly as necessary as breathing. Ilara would go to Virlanda to restore the past, but Isolde would go, too. Not to reclaim what was lost, that was impossible now, but to finally close a chapter that had remained open for far too long. She would tell her family she was taking a European tour, exploring the patisserie traditions of France and surrounding countries. At 67, surely she had earned the right to one final adventure, and if that adventure happened to take her to a small kingdom where she had once been young and foolish enough to believe in fairy tales, well, perhaps it was time to face those memories at last. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere across the ocean, in a palace that was now a museum, her granddaughter's future was waiting. And perhaps in some small way, Isolde's past was waiting there too. Not to be relived, but to be understood, forgiven and finally laid to rest. The plane descended through layers of grey clouds, and Isolde pressed her face to the small window, watching the countryside of Virlanda emerge below, like a watercolor painting coming to life. Rolling green hills dotted with stone cottages gave way to the sprawling capital city of Lysander, its medieval towers and modern buildings creating a tapestry of old and new that made her heart ache with recognition. Beside her, Ilara slept peacefully, her head resting against the seatback, exhaustion finally overtaking the excitement that had sustained her through the long journey. Isolde smoothed a strand of hair from her granddaughter's face, marveling at how the young woman had simply accepted her grandmother's sudden decision to join her European adventure. "I've always wanted to see the bakeries of France," Isolde had explained when she announced her intention to book a ticket to Europe just days after receiving the letter. "And since you'll be so close in Virlanda, it seems like perfect timing." The truth was more complicated, of course. In the 3 weeks since learning of Ilara's appointment, Isolde had thrown herself into preparations with an intensity that surprised even herself. She had arranged for her neighbor's daughter to manage the bakery, renewed her long-expired passport, and booked a small apartment in Lysander's old quarter, close enough to the Chateau de Lys to feel connected to Ilara's work, but far enough to maintain the pretense of her independent culinary tour. Now, as the plane touched down on Virland soil for the first time in 43 years, Isolde felt her carefully constructed composure threatening to crumble. The last time she had made this journey, she had been 24 years old, filled with dreams, and naive enough to believe that love could conquer any obstacle. She was returning as a woman who had lived an entire lifetime in the shadow of that brief transformative summer. The airport was smaller than she had expected, modern but retaining touches of old-world charm in its stone arches and wrought-iron details. As they waited for their luggage, Ilara studied a map of the city, her finger tracing the route from the airport to the palace. "Look, Grandma," she said, pointing to a small illustration of the Chateau de Lys. "Isn't it beautiful? The guidebook says parts of it date back to the 14th century, but most of the current structure was built in the 17th and 18th centuries." Isolde nodded, though she could have described every room and corridor from memory. The grand staircase with its carved banister, the library with its floor-to-ceiling, windows overlooking the rose garden, the small alcove in the east wing, where she and Thorian had shared their first kiss on a warm July evening when the air was heavy with the scent of jasmine. A representative from the museum met them at baggage claim, a young man with curly brown hair and an enthusiastic smile, who introduced himself as Oliver Hartmann, assistant to Dr. Helena Voss. He greeted Ilara with professional warmth and nodded politely to Isolde when she was introduced as Ilara's grandmother. "We're so pleased you could join us, Miss Marlowe," Oliver said as he helped load their suitcases into a small van marked with the museum's logo. "Dr. Voss is eager to meet you and show you the portraits you'll be working on. Some of them haven't been properly restored in decades." The drive through Lysander was both familiar and strange to Isolde's eyes. The city had grown significantly since her last visit, with new residential areas sprawling beyond the medieval walls, but the part of the old town remained largely unchanged. They passed the market square where she had once bought fresh flowers every morning, the small cafe where she had written letters home to her parents, the bookshop where Thorian had introduced her to poetry she had never forgotten. "The palace is just ahead," Oliver announced as they turned onto a tree-lined avenue that Isolde remembered walking countless times. It was converted to a museum in 1975, about 10 years after Prince Thorian formally donated it to the state. He kept only a small private wing for himself until his death. Ilara leaned forward with interest. "I've been researching Prince Thorian. Such a fascinating figure. Do you know much about his personal life?" Oliver glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "More than most, actually. My grandmother was Margaret Hartmann. She worked as a housekeeper in the palace for 30 years. She used to tell stories about the prince when I was young. He was apparently quite different from what people expected of royalty. Very down-to-earth, passionate about education and social reform, and incredibly private about his personal affairs." Isolde's hands clenched in her lap. Margaret Hartmann. The name brought back a flood of memories. A kind-faced woman in her 50s who had taken pity on a young American student wandering the palace gardens during a public tour. Margaret had been the one to introduce her to Thorian, mentioning that there was another young person interested in the palace's history. "Is your grandmother still alive?" Isolde asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Oh yes, though she's retired now. Lives in a cottage not far from here. She's 86 and still sharp as a tack. Loves to talk about the old days if anyone's willing to listen." The van rounded a curve, and suddenly the Chateau de Lys rose before them, its pale stone walls and distinctive towers exactly as Isolde remembered. The sight hit her like a physical blow, and she gripped the door. Handled to steady herself. 4 decades fell away in an instant, and she was 24 again, standing before those same gates with her heart pounding and her future stretching ahead like an unwritten page. "Magnificent, isn't it?" Oliver said, pulling through the main gates that now bore a discreet museum sign. "The restoration work we've done over the past few years has really brought it back to its former glory." They parked in what had once been the carriage house, now converted to a modern visitor center and staff facilities. As they unloaded the luggage, Isolde caught sight of the gardens stretching beyond the main building, and her breath caught. The rose garden where she and Thorian had spent so many evenings was still there, though more formal now. with neat pathways and educational plaques that transformed wild, romantic spaces into carefully curated displays. Dr. Helena Voss met them at the staff entrance, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the focused intensity of someone passionate about her work. She greeted Ilara with genuine enthusiasm, discussing the restoration project with an expertise that quickly put the young woman at ease. "And you must be Mrs. Marlowe," Dr. Voss said, turning to Isolde with a polite smile. "Oliver mentioned you're touring European bakeries. How wonderful to combine cultural exploration with family support." "Something like that," Isolde replied, though the words felt hollow in her throat. They were given a brief tour of the museum's public areas, the grand hall where tourists now admired tapestries and artifacts, the former ballroom that housed an exhibition on Vierlande's transition to democracy, the library that had been converted to a research center. Each room carried echoes of Isolde's memories, but overlaid now with the patina of institutional preservation. "Tomorrow we'll show you the restoration workshop," Dr. Voss told Ilara as they concluded the tour. "It's in the East Wing, where we've set up proper climate controls and lighting for the delicate work you'll be doing." The East Wing. Isolde's steps faltered slightly. That was where Thorian's private apartments had been, where she had spent so many afternoons listening to him read aloud from his favorite books, or discussing the future they had naively assumed they would share. "Are you all right, Grandma?" Ilara asked, noticing her sudden pallor. "Just tired from the journey," Isolde said, forcing a smile. "Perhaps we should get settled in our accommodations." Oliver drove them into the city centre, where their paths would diverge. Ilara was staying in a small guest house affiliated with the museum, while Isolde had rented an apartment in the old quarter. They agreed to meet for dinner that evening, giving Isolde a few precious hours alone to process the overwhelming tide of memories that threatened to drown her. The apartment was on the third floor of a narrow building that dated to the 18th century, its windows overlooking a small square with a fountain and several cafes. As Isolde unpacked her few belongings, she found herself drawn repeatedly to those windows, watching the people below go about their daily lives, in a city that had once been the backdrop for the most important chapter of her own story. That evening she walked slowly through the familiar streets toward the restaurant where she had arranged to meet Ilara. Every corner held a memory: the bridge where she and Thorian had fed ducks on lazy Sunday afternoons, the small church where they had attended a concert of medieval music, the narrow alley where he had first taken her hand and she had felt her entire world shift on its axis. Ilara was already seated when she arrived, studying a folder of materials Dr. Voss had given her about the restoration project. Her face was animated with excitement as she described her first impressions of the palace and her anticipation for beginning work. "The portraits are incredible, Grandma. There's one of Prince Thorian that's particularly striking, painted when he was probably in his late 20s. He has the most remarkable eyes, so expressive. I can see why people were drawn to him." Isolde's throat tightened. "Have you seen his private quarters?" "Not yet, but Dr. Voss mentioned that some of his personal effects are still on display in a section of the East Wing. Apparently, he left specific instructions that certain rooms be preserved exactly as they were. It's almost like a time capsule." After dinner, they walked slowly back through the quiet streets, Ilara chatting about her plans for the coming weeks, while Isolde listened with half her attention. The other half was consumed by the weight of proximity. Somewhere in this small city were the very rooms where she had fallen in love, the bed where Thorian had slept, the desk where he had written the letters she had never answered. "I should let you rest," Ilara said when they reached Isolde's building. "Tomorrow is going to be a big day for both of us. Your bakery tour and my first day of real work." Alone in her apartment, Isolde sat by the window long into the night, watching the fountain in the square catch and scatter moonlight. Somewhere across the city, in rooms she had once known as intimately as her own home, lay the traces of a life that had been shaped by her absence. Thorian had never married, never had children, had spent 40 years carrying the memory of a summer love who had vanished without explanation. The weight of that knowledge settled over her like a heavy blanket. Tomorrow she would begin the delicate process of reclaiming a past she had never truly left behind. But first, she needed to find the courage to face what that past had cost, not just her, but the man who had loved her enough to give up a kingdom, even though she had never known it. The restoration workshop occupied what had once been Thorian's private study, though Isolde didn't reveal this knowledge as she accompanied Ilara for her first official day of work. Watching her granddaughter set up her equipment and examine the portraits with professional intensity, Isolde felt the strange sensation of time folding in on itself, past and present existing simultaneously in this space, where she had once sat reading while Thorian worked at his correspondence. "The portrait of Prince Thorian is the most challenging," Ilara explained to her grandmother, gesturing toward a large canvas that dominated one wall. "There's some damage to the background, and the varnish has yellowed significantly over the decades, but underneath you can see the artist captured something special. Look at his expression." Isolde stepped closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. The portrait showed Thorian as she had never seen him, formally dressed in the regalia of his position, but with that same gentle smile she remembered from their quiet moments together. The artist had indeed captured something essential, the warmth that made him seem approachable despite his royal bearing, the intelligence in his dark eyes, the hint of melancholy that she now understood had been present even then. "He looks kind," she managed to say. "Doesn't he? Dr. Voss told me this was painted around 1958, commissioned for his 26th birthday. He would have been expected to marry soon after, but instead he broke his engagement and eventually abdicated. I keep wondering what could have caused such a dramatic change in his life plans." Dr. Voss entered the workshop at that moment, carrying a folder of archival materials. "Good morning, Miss Marlowe. I trust you slept well. And Mrs. Marlowe, how lovely to see you again. I hope you're finding our little city interesting for your culinary research." "Very much so," Isolde replied, though she had spent the morning walking aimlessly through streets that held too many memories rather than investigating bakeries. "I have some exciting news," Dr. Voss continued, addressing Ilara. "We've received permission to access additional archival materials related to Prince Thorian's personal effects. There are some items that have never been publicly displayed, including correspondence and personal documents that might provide context for the portraits you're restoring." Ilara's eyes lit up with scholarly enthusiasm. "That would be incredibly helpful for understanding the historical context. When can I see them?" "This afternoon, if you'd like. They're stored in the archive room, which is actually part of the prince's former private quarters. We've maintained those rooms exactly as he left them, per his specific instructions." Isolde felt the blood drain from her face. She had assumed those rooms would be off-limits, transformed beyond recognition by 4 decades of institutional management. The thought that they remained unchanged was both thrilling and terrifying. "Would it be possible for my grandmother to join us?" Ilara asked. "She has a real appreciation for history, and I know she'd find it fascinating." Dr. Voss hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I suppose that would be acceptable, as long as we're careful with the materials. Some of them are quite fragile." The rest of the morning passed in a blur for Isolde. She attempted to focus on Ilara's work, asking appropriate questions about restoration techniques and admiring her granddaughter's careful, methodical approach to cleaning centuries of accumulated grime from the portraits. But her mind kept drifting to the afternoon's promised revelation. At lunch, they were joined by Oliver, who had news that made Isolde's hands tremble around her coffee cup. "I mentioned your grandmother to my grandmother last night," he told Ilara. "Margaret Hartman, the former housekeeper I told you about. She's quite excited to hear about the restoration project, and she wondered if she might meet you sometime. She has such vivid memories of Prince Thorian and the palace during its active years." "I would love that," Ilara replied immediately. "What a wonderful primary source for historical context." "Would this afternoon be too soon? She lives just a few minutes from the palace, and she's quite eager to share her stories. She doesn't get many visitors these days." Isolde's throat constricted. Margaret Hartman, the woman who had been there during those precious weeks, who had witnessed the beginning of everything, and who might know far more about its ending than Isolde had ever realized. "Actually," she said carefully, "I'd be very interested in meeting her as well. I'm fascinated by the domestic history of great houses, how the staff lived and worked behind the scenes." Oliver beamed. "She'll be delighted. Grandmother loves an audience for her stories." That afternoon they gathered in Dr. Voss's office, a room that had once been part of the palace's administrative wing, but felt neutral enough to ease Isolde's anxiety. The archivist, a thin man named Professor Kellner, had arranged several boxes of materials on a large table. each item carefully preserved in acid-free folders. Prince Thorian was meticulous about his correspondence, Professor Kellner explained as he opened the first box. We have letters dating back to his university years, diplomatic correspondence from his brief period of official duties, and personal letters that were never sent. Ilara leaned forward with professional curiosity. Never sent? Quite a few, actually. All addressed to the same recipient, someone in the United States. We've never been able to determine the identity of the recipient, as the prince used only a first name, Isolde. The room seemed to tilt around Isolde, and she gripped the edge of her chair to steady herself. 40 years of unsent letters, all bearing her name. The magnitude of it was overwhelming. How romantic, Ilara said softly. A lost love. That would certainly explain his decision never to marry. Dr. Voss nodded. We've always assumed it was connected to his year of cultural exchange studies in the United States. He returned quite changed, according to the historical records, more serious, more committed to social causes, and completely uninterested in the marriage arrangements his family had made. Professor Kellner was lifting items from the second box now, personal effects that made Isolde's vision blur with recognition. A fountain pen she had given him for his birthday, a pressed flower from the palace gardens, a small leather journal with her initials embossed on the cover, a gift she had forgotten until this moment. This journal is particularly interesting, the professor continued. The prince kept detailed records of his daily activities and thoughts. The entries from the summer of 1959 are quite revealing about his emotional state. He opened the journal to a random page, and Isolde caught sight of Thorian's familiar handwriting. Isolde taught me about American folk songs today. Her voice when she sings reminds me of everything beautiful in the world. I cannot imagine how empty life will seem when she returns to her country. Perhaps we shouldn't read from his private journal, Isolde said quickly, her voice hoarse with emotion. It seems intrusive. Of course, Professor Kellner agreed, closing the journal respectfully, though these materials will be invaluable for Miss Marlowe's historical research. Ilara was studying her grandmother with concern. Are you feeling all right? You look quite pale. Just warm, Isolde managed. Perhaps some fresh air. Dr. Voss led them from the office through a series of corridors that Isolde remembered with painful clarity. They were heading toward the East Wing, toward rooms she had not entered in 43 years. Each step felt like walking through layers of time, peeling back decades to reveal the young woman she had once been. These were Prince Thorian's private apartments, Dr. Voss explained, as they reached a set of tall, wooden doors. He lived here until his death in 1983. His will specified that these rooms be preserved exactly as they were, with limited access for scholarly research only. She unlocked the doors, and they stepped into a sitting room that took Isolde's breath away. Everything was exactly as she remembered. The deep blue sofa where they had spent countless hours talking, the bookshelves lined with his favorite volumes of poetry and history, the small writing desk by the window where he had worked on his correspondence each morning. But there were additions too, evidence of the 40 years she had missed. Photographs on the mantelpiece showed Thorian at various charity events and public ceremonies, always alone, but always smiling kindly at the camera. A wheelchair sat folded in one corner, suggesting that his later years had been marked by physical challenges she had never known about. He lived simply, Dr. Voss observed. Despite his wealth and position, he chose a modest lifestyle focused on his philanthropic work. Ilara was examining the books on one shelf, reading titles aloud. American poetry, Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, Robert Frost. He certainly had an interest in American literature. That developed during his exchange year, Dr. Voss replied. He often spoke about how that experience shaped his worldview. On the writing desk, Isolde noticed, sat a small framed photograph that made her heart stop. It was a picture of her, taken during one of their afternoon walks in the palace gardens. She was laughing at something he had said, her young face radiant with happiness. Somehow he had kept it all these years, displayed prominently in his most private space. Who is that? Ilara asked, following her grandmother's gaze. Dr. Voss approached the desk to look more closely at the photograph. We've never been able to identify her. It's unsigned, and there are no records to help us determine who she might have been, but clearly, someone very important to the prince. Isolde felt tears threatening and turned away quickly. pretending to examine a landscape painting on the opposite wall. The weight of knowledge, of all the years lost, all the love unexpressed, all the chances never taken, was becoming unbearable. "We should visit Margaret Hartman now," she said abruptly. "I don't want to keep her waiting." The cottage where Margaret Hartman lived was indeed just minutes from the palace, a charming stone house with a garden full of autumn flowers. The woman who answered the door was elderly but spry, with bright blue eyes that immediately fixed on Isolde's face with startling intensity. "Oliver, dear boy, come in," she said, embracing her grandson. "And you must be Miss Marlowe, the art restorer. How lovely to meet you." But as her gaze shifted to Isolde, her expression changed dramatically. The color drained from her weathered cheeks, and she gripped the doorframe for support. "Dear God," she whispered. "It can't be. After all, these years—" Isolde felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as she met the older woman's knowing gaze. Margaret Hartman remembered her. After 4 decades, the woman who had once brought them tea in the garden still recognized the young American student who had disappeared without explanation. "I think," Margaret said quietly, still staring at Isolde, "we have quite a lot to talk about." Margaret Hartman's sitting room was cozy and warm, filled with the comfortable clutter of a life well lived. Photographs covered every available surface: family gatherings, grandchildren's school portraits, and prominently displayed among them several images of palace life from decades past. Isolde recognized herself in one of them, standing in the background of a group shot taken during a public garden tour. "Sit down, dear," Margaret said, her voice gentle but firm as she gestured toward the sofa. "Oliver, would you put the kettle on? I think we're going to need tea for this conversation." Ilara looked confused, glancing between her grandmother and their hostess. "Have you two met before?" "Oh, yes," Margaret replied, settling into her favorite armchair and fixing Isolde with a steady gaze. "Though it was a very long time ago, 43 years to be precise." Isolde felt exposed under that knowing look, as if all her carefully constructed defenses were crumbling. "Mrs. Hartman, Margaret, please. We're far beyond formalities now." The older woman leaned forward. "Slightly. You haven't changed as much as you might think, my dear. Oh, your hair is silver now instead of auburn, and there are lines around your eyes. But you have the same expression you used to get when you were trying to solve some difficult problem." Oliver returned from the kitchen, carrying a tea tray and looking puzzled by the sudden tension in the room. "Grandmother, you're being rather mysterious. How do you know Mrs. Marlowe?" Margaret poured tea with steady hands, though Isolde noticed the slight tremor of age that hadn't been there when she was younger. "Your grandmother," she said to Ilara, "spent the summer of 1959 at the Château de Lille as part of a cultural exchange program. She was supposed to be studying European history and art, but she spent most of her time in the palace gardens with Prince Thorian." Ilara's teacup rattled against its saucer as she set it down abruptly. "What?" "It was quite the romance," Margaret continued, her eyes soft with memory. "The Prince was completely smitten. I'd never seen him so happy, so alive. He would ask me to pack picnic lunches for their afternoon excursions, and he'd return each evening with flowers for her from the gardens." Isolde found her voice at last, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Margaret, please." "Please what, dear? The truth has been buried long enough, don't you think?" Margaret turned to Ilara, whose face had gone pale with shock. "Your grandmother was the great love of Prince Thorian's life, and judging by the way she's looking right now, I'd say the feeling was entirely mutual." The silence that followed was deafening. Oliver stared open-mouthed between the 3 women, clearly trying to process this unexpected revelation. Ilara looked as if she had been struck by lightning, her gaze fixed on her grandmother with a mixture of wonder and betrayal. "Grandma?" Ilara's voice was small, uncertain. "Is this true?" Isolde closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 4 decades of carefully maintained silence pressing down on her. When she opened them again, she met her granddaughter's questioning gaze with as much honesty as she could manage. "Yes," she said simply. "It's true. But you never said anything. You never mentioned knowing him even when I was researching his life." Ilara's voice rose slightly, hurt bleeding through her professional composure. "You let me go on about how romantic and mysterious his lost love story was, and you never told me it was you." "How could I?" Isolde asked, her own emotions finally breaking through. "How could I explain that I fell in love with a man I thought was a university student, only to discover he was a prince? that I fled the country without explanation because I couldn't face the impossibility of our situation. Margaret was nodding slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in her expression. That's why you disappeared so suddenly. One day you were there, planning to extend your stay, and the next morning, you were gone. The prince was beside himself with worry. He had the staff searching everywhere, contacted the American embassy, wrote letters to every address he could find. I know, Isolde whispered. I received one of them, eventually. Just one? Margaret asked sharply. He sent dozens over the years, letters to universities, to your family's address, to cultural exchange organizations. He never stopped trying to find you. Ilara was staring at her grandmother as if seeing her for the first time. Why did you run away? If you loved each other, why didn't you at least try to make it work? Isolde stood abruptly, moving to the window where she could see the palace towers rising above the trees. The afternoon sun was setting behind them, casting long shadows across the familiar landscape. Because I was 24 years old and terrified, she said finally. Because I discovered his true identity at a public ceremony where he was announced as heir to the throne, surrounded by dignitaries and wearing ceremonial robes that made him look like a stranger. Because I realized that everything I thought I knew about our relationship was based on a lie. Not a lie, Margaret interjected firmly. Thorian never lied to you about who he was as a person. He simply didn't burden you with the complications of his position. In private, he was exactly the man you fell in love with. But don't you see? Isolde turned back to face them, her composure finally cracking. I thought he was someone I could build a life with. A history student who shared my love of books and quiet conversations. I didn't know I was falling in love with a prince who would someday be king, who would need to marry for political alliance and produce heirs for the kingdom. Oliver spoke up for the first time since the revelation. But he didn't become king. He abdicated his claim to the throne. I didn't know that then, Isolde replied. I only learned about his abdication today from you. When I left Virlanda, I thought I was saving us both from an impossible situation. Margaret was watching her with growing understanding, but also with a sharpness that suggested she sensed there was more to the story. There's something else, isn't there? Some other reason you felt you couldn't contact him even after you returned home. Isolde felt Ilara's eyes boring into her, and she knew the moment of complete truth had arrived. For 43 years, she had carried this secret alone, allowing everyone, including her late husband, to believe that her first daughter was born of a brief relationship in college. Now, with the past literally surrounding her in this small room filled with palace photographs, she could no longer maintain the fiction. I was pregnant, she said quietly. When I left Virlanda, I didn't know yet. I discovered it 6 weeks later, back in South Carolina. The admission hit the room like a physical blow. Ilara gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. Oliver's teacup slipped from his fingers, shattering against the floor. Margaret alone seemed unsurprised, as if this final piece of the puzzle had been expected. Sarah, Margaret said softly, your daughter Sarah was Thorian's child. Isolde nodded, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. I thought about telling him, but how could I? He was a prince dealing with the political aftermath of breaking a royal engagement. How could I complicate his life further with the news that he had fathered a child? With an American commoner who had fled his country without explanation. So you raised her alone, Ilara whispered. Mum never knew who her real father was. Robert knew, Isolde said, referring to her late husband. When I met him 2 years later, I told him the truth. He was a good man, a kind man. He adopted Sarah legally and loved her as his own daughter. She never had any reason to question her parentage. Margaret stood slowly, her movements careful with age, and walked to a small writing desk in the corner of the room. From one of its drawers, she retrieved a worn envelope that she handed to Isolde with trembling fingers. This arrived about 6 months after you disappeared, she said. I was still working at the palace then, handling some of the prince's personal correspondence. When I saw the American postmark and recognized your handwriting, I kept it. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment to give it to him, but the truth is, I was afraid of what it might contain. Afraid it might hurt him more than he was already hurting. Isolde stared at the envelope, recognizing her own younger handwriting addressing it to Mr. Thorian Leclerc at the palace. Inside was the letter she had written and rewritten dozens of times, the one where she had tried to explain her departure and her pregnancy, The letter she had ultimately decided not to send, choosing instead to protect him from what she saw as an impossible burden. "You never sent it," Margaret observed. "I thought it would be kinder to let him forget me and move on with his life." "Move on?" Margaret's voice carried decades of gentle reproach. "My dear, he never moved on. He spent the rest of his life comparing every woman he met to the memory of you. He established charitable foundations in your honor, used his position to advocate for the kinds of social causes you had talked about during those summer evenings. He kept your photograph on his desk for 40 years. The weight of this revelation was staggering. Isolde sank back into her chair, overwhelmed by the knowledge of how thoroughly her choice had shaped not just her own life, but Thorian's as well. "He loved you until the day he died," Margaret continued softly, "and you loved him enough to give up your own happiness to protect his. You were both fools, but you were noble fools." Ilara had been silent throughout most of this exchange, processing the complete upheaval of everything she thought she knew about her family. History. Now she looked at her grandmother with eyes that held a complex mixture of understanding and grief. "That means Prince Thorian was my grandfather," she said slowly. "My biological grandfather." "Yes," Isolde whispered. "And I'm here, working on his portrait, restoring images of the man who was my family, and I never knew." Ilara's voice broke slightly. "God, Grandma, how have you carried this alone for so long?" Margaret was nodding thoughtfully, studying Ilara's face with new interest. "Now I understand why you looked familiar when I first saw you. You have his eyes, dear, and something about the way you hold yourself when you're concentrating on your work. It's exactly how he looked when he was writing his letters." As the evening deepened around them, the four people in Margaret's sitting room sat in contemplative silence, each processing the magnitude of what had been revealed. 43 years of separation, of missed opportunities, and carefully guarded secrets had been laid bare in the space of a single afternoon. But with the truth finally spoken, Isolde felt something she hadn't experienced in decades, the possibility of peace. The past could not be changed, but perhaps, finally, it could be understood and accepted. And perhaps, in some small way, the love that had shaped 2 lives across an ocean and 4 decades of silence could finally find a way to honor both the joy it had brought and the sacrifice it had required. The next morning dawned grey and misty, matching Isolde's emotional state as she sat in her small apartment, staring at the unopened letter that Margaret had kept for 43 years. The envelope seemed to pulse with significance on her kitchen table, beside a cup of tea that had long since grown cold. Ilara had left early for the palace, needing time alone to process the revelations of the previous day before facing the portrait of her biological grandfather. They had talked late into the night after returning from Margaret's cottage, but words seemed inadequate to bridge the chasm between a lifetime of carefully maintained silence and the sudden explosion of truth. The letter represented a turning point, the moment when Isolde had almost chosen differently, almost reached across the ocean to bridge the gap her fear had created. But she had pulled back, sealed the letter away, convinced that silence was the kinder choice. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope and unfolded the pages within. Confronting her younger self's careful script, "My dearest Thorian, I have started this letter 100 times and each attempt feels more inadequate than the last. How do you explain to someone you love that you left without goodbye because you were too much of a coward to face an impossible situation? By now you know I have returned to America. What you don't know is why I left so suddenly, why I couldn't bring myself to face you after that ceremony where I saw you as you truly are. Not just the kind history student I fell in love with, but Prince Thorian, heir to a throne and bound by obligations I could never understand. I realized that everything I thought I knew about our future was built on my own naive assumptions. You never lied to me, but I lied to myself, believing we could somehow build a simple life together. When I saw you in that ceremony, surrounded by the weight of your position and your destiny, I understood how foolish I had been. But there is something else you must know, something that makes my silence both more necessary and more painful. I am carrying your child, Thorian. Our weeks together have created a life that will forever connect us, even as circumstances keep us apart." The letter continued for several more pages, chronicling her fears, her love, and her decision to protect him from what she saw as an impossible burden. Reading it now, 43 years later, Isolde could see both the wisdom and the tragic blindness of her younger self. A Soft knock at her door interrupted her reading. She opened it to find Oliver standing in the hallway, his expression unusually serious. "Mrs. Marlowe, I hope I'm not intruding. My grandmother sent me to check on you and I wanted to talk about what we learned yesterday." She invited him in, offering tea while they settled in her small sitting area. Oliver seemed to be wrestling with something important, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by thoughtful gravity. "I've been thinking about what grandmother told us," he began. "About Prince Thorian's letters, the ones he sent trying to find you. She mentioned that she helped him with his correspondence, but she didn't tell you everything." Isolde felt her heart skip. "What do you mean?" "After you disappeared, the prince became... obsessed isn't too strong a word. He hired private investigators, contacted government agencies, reached out to every university and cultural organization that might have records of your exchange. Program. Grandmother said it went on for years. The knowledge that Thorian had searched so desperately for her was both comforting and heartbreaking. But he never found me." "Actually," Oliver said carefully, "I think he might have. Grandmother mentioned something last night after you left that she didn't say in front of everyone. She said there was a point, maybe 5 or 6 years after you left, when the prince suddenly stopped his search. Just gave up completely. She always wondered what had happened to change his mind so dramatically." Isolde frowned, trying to remember anything from that time period that might explain such a shift. "I don't understand. What could have made him stop looking? I think we should ask her. Grandmother is very sharp and she remembers everything from those days. If there's more to the story, she'll know." They found Margaret in her garden, tending to the last autumn flowers before the first frost. She looked up as they approached, her perceptive gaze taking in Isolde's red-rimmed eyes and Oliver's serious expression. "You've been reading the letter," she observed gently. "How difficult that must have been, seeing your younger self struggle so clearly." "Margaret," Isolde said, "Oliver mentioned that Thorian stopped searching for me at some point. Do you know why?" The older woman's hands stilled on her pruning shears, and she was quiet for a long moment. When she looked up, her expression was complicated, part sadness, part regret, part something that might have been guilt. "There was an incident," she said finally. "In 1965, about 6 years after you left, the prince had hired a private investigator in America, a persistent man who had tracked down several leads over the years. This time he found you." Isolde's breath caught. "Found me? You were living in Charleston then, married to Robert Marlowe, with a young daughter who would have been about 5 years old. The investigator took photographs, gathered information about your life. He was preparing a full report for the prince when..." Margaret's voice trailed off and she looked away, clearly struggling with the memory. "When what?" Oliver prompted gently. "When I made a decision that I've regretted every day since," Margaret said quietly. "The investigator contacted me first. He knew I had worked closely with the prince and wanted to understand how to present the information sensitively. He showed me the photographs, told me about your new life." Isolde felt the world tilting around her. "What did you do?" "I saw that you were happy," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were smiling in the photographs, holding your daughter's hand, clearly settled in a good marriage with a kind man. And I thought that if the prince learned about your daughter, if he realized she might be his child, it would destroy the peace you had found." The implications hit Isolde like a physical blow. "You told him not to contact me." "I told him you had moved on, built a new life, and that pursuing you further would only cause pain for everyone involved. I showed him the photographs of your family and convinced him that the kind thing to do would be to let you stay happy in the life you had chosen." The garden seemed to spin around Isolde as she processed this revelation. Thorian had found her. He had known about Sarah, or at least suspected, and he had chosen to stay away, because Margaret had convinced him it was the noble thing to do. "He listened to you," she said, though it came out as more of a question. "He was devastated, but yes, the prince was always more concerned with other people's happiness than his own. When I convinced him that contacting you would disrupt the peace you had found, he agreed to stop searching. But it broke something in him, Isolde. He was never quite the same after that." Oliver was staring at his grandmother with shock. "You mean all these years, they could have been in contact? They could have found a way to be part of each other's lives?" "Perhaps," Margaret said sadly. "Or perhaps my interference prevented even greater heartbreak. I'll never know for certain, and that uncertainty has haunted me for decades." Isolde sank onto a nearby garden bench, overwhelmed by the cascade of missed opportunities and well-intentioned decisions that had shaped so many lives. He knew about Sarah. He suspected, Margaret corrected. The timing would have been obvious to him, but he chose to honor what he believed were your wishes, just as you chose to honor what you believed were his. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of revealed truth settling around them like autumn leaves. Finally, Oliver spoke up. "There's something else, isn't there? Something you haven't told us yet." Margaret nodded slowly. The prince left detailed instructions about his papers and personal effects. Most were to be preserved for historical research, but there were some items, private. Letters, personal documents, that were to be sealed for 50 years after his death. We've never opened them because his death was in 1983, which means they can be opened in 2033, Isolde calculated. Still 10 years away. Unless, Margaret said carefully, the person they were written for gives permission. According to his will, if the letters were ever claimed by their intended recipient, they could be opened immediately. The implication hung in the air between them. Somewhere in the Palace archives were Thorian's most private thoughts, possibly including letters meant for her, documents that might shed light on his feelings and decisions throughout the 40 years of their separation. "Where are these sealed documents?" Isolde asked. "In the archives at the palace. Dr. Voss is the only one with access, and she takes the responsibility very seriously. But if you were to approach her, to explain the situation..." Isolde stood abruptly, her decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. "I need to see them. After all these years of wondering, of living with incomplete knowledge, I need to understand what he really thought and felt." As they walked back toward the palace, Isolde felt as if she were approaching the final chapter of a story that had begun 43 years ago in a summer garden. Whatever those sealed documents contained, love letters, recriminations, or simply the day-to-day thoughts of a man trying to understand why the woman he loved had vanished from his life, she was finally ready to face the complete truth. Behind them, Margaret Hartman watched their retreating figures with a mixture of hope and apprehension. She had spent decades carrying the weight of her intervention in their story. Now, perhaps, she would finally learn whether her choices had been acts of compassion or tragedy. Dr. Helena Voss listened to Isolde's request with the careful attention of someone trained to handle historical revelations with appropriate gravity. They sat in her office while afternoon light filtered through tall windows, the same windows where Isolde had once stood with Thorian, discussing books and dreams and futures they would never share. "This is highly irregular," Dr. Voss said finally, though her voice carried fascination rather than disapproval. "In all my years managing historical collections, I've never encountered a situation quite like this." Ilara sat beside her grandmother, still processing the morning's revelations about Margaret's interference and the sealed documents. The restoration work had been abandoned for the day. How could she focus on cleaning varnish from Thorian's portrait when she was still adjusting to the knowledge that his blood ran through her veins? "I understand your position," Isolde replied, "but I am the person referenced in those documents. If Prince Thorian wrote letters intended for me, don't I have some right to see them?" "The legal question is complex," Dr. Voss admitted, "but ethically, yes, I believe you do have that right. However, I must ask, are you prepared for what you might find? These documents have remained sealed for 40 years. Their contents could be difficult." Isolde had been asking herself the same question since leaving Margaret's garden. Was she strong enough to confront Thorian's private thoughts about her disappearance, his possible anger or disappointment, his eventual acceptance of her absence from his life? "I've lived with incomplete knowledge for 4 decades, she said finally. "Whatever pain those documents might contain, it can't be worse than the uncertainty I've carried all this time." Dr. Voss nodded slowly. "Very well, but I insist on certain conditions. Professor Kellner must be present as an official witness. The documents will be examined in a controlled environment, and we must make detailed records of everything we discover. This is still a significant historical moment, regardless of its personal importance to you." An hour. Later, they gathered in the climate-controlled archive room deep in the palace basement. Professor Kellner had prepared a workspace with proper lighting and preservation materials, his excitement at this unprecedented situation barely contained behind professional decorum. The sealed collection occupied 2 fireproof filing cabinets, their locks unchanged since 1983. Dr. Voss produced the key, an ornate brass piece that seemed to carry the weight of decades, and opened the first cabinet with ceremonial care. Inside were dozens of folders, each meticulously labeled in Thorian's familiar handwriting, letters arranged by year, personal journals, and several larger envelopes marked with instructions like to be opened only by Isolde, and private correspondence not for historical record. Isolde's hands shook as she lifted the first envelope bearing her name. The weight of it suggested multiple pages, and the slight indentations on the paper showed where Thorian's fountain pen had pressed deeply into the page, as if the words had been written with particular intensity. "Would you like privacy to read these?" Dr. Voss asked gently. Isolde considered, then shook her head. "No, this story has lived in shadows long enough. Besides, these documents will become part of the historical record eventually. Better to have witnesses to their contents from the beginning." She opened the envelope with steady fingers and unfolded the pages within. The first letter was dated December 1959, 3 months after her departure. "My dearest Isolde, I have written you 50 letters in my mind, but this is the first I have committed to paper. Perhaps I will never send it. Perhaps I will burn it, as I have burned the others. But tonight I cannot bear the silence any longer. I do not know why you left without explanation. I have searched my memory for some moment when I might have frightened you, some word or action that drove you away, but I can find nothing. Did you discover who I am? Did the weight of my position make our simple happiness impossible to bear? If that is the case, I want you to know that I would give up this throne, this crown, this entire kingdom, if it meant one more afternoon with you in the garden. The responsibilities I was born to seem meaningless without someone to share them, and no one has ever understood my heart the way you did in those precious weeks." The letter continued for several pages, alternating between desperate love and confused pain. Isolde read it aloud, her voice breaking occasionally as Thorian's emotions reached across 4 decades to grip her heart. The second letter was dated 6 months later. "Isolde, I have hired investigators to find you. This feels like a violation of your obvious wish to disappear from my life, but I cannot accept that what we shared meant nothing to you. If you are in danger, if someone forced you to leave, please know that I will move heaven and earth to help you. If you simply realize that a prince cannot offer you the simple life you wanted, please have the courage to tell me so. I can bear rejection, but I cannot bear this uncertainty." As they progressed through the documents, a heartbreaking pattern emerged. The early letters were desperate, searching, filled with plans to find her and win her back. Gradually they evolved into acceptance, then into a kind of philosophical resignation that spoke of a man learning to live with permanent heartbreak. From 1965, the year Margaret had intervened, there was a dramatic shift. The letters became shorter, more formal, as if Thorian were practicing distance from his own emotions. "Isolde, I have learned that you have found happiness in marriage and motherhood. Though this knowledge brings me both joy and sorrow, I am grateful that you have built the kind of life I always knew you deserved. Your daughter is beautiful. She has your eyes. I will not intrude upon the peace you have found, but I want you to know that my love for you has never diminished. It has simply transformed into a wish for your continued happiness, even if I cannot be part of it. I am establishing a foundation in your honor, though I will never use your name publicly. It will focus on educational opportunities for young women, particularly in the arts. Perhaps some good can come from this great love that was never allowed to flourish. Be well, my dearest heart. Be happy." T. Ilara was crying openly by this point, tissues scattered around her chair as she absorbed the depth of emotion in her grandfather's words. "He saw photographs of my mother. He knew she was his daughter, but he stayed away because he thought that's what you wanted." Isolde nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. The tragic irony was overwhelming. 2 people who had loved each other completely, both choosing sacrifice over selfishness, both convinced they were protecting the other from pain. The later documents revealed the full scope of Thorian's response to their separation. He had indeed abdicated his claim to the throne, dedicating his life to charitable works and social reform. Many of his initiatives bore subtle references to their conversations: educational programs inspired by her passion for learning, agricultural supports that echoed her stories about her family's farm, arts funding that reflected her creative spirit. He had never married, never had other children, though several letters referenced women his family had tried to match him with. Each potential relationship was measured against the memory of a summer love that had spoiled him for anyone else. The final documents were the most difficult to read. Thorian's last letter to her was dated just months before his death in 1983. My beloved Isolde, as I write this, I am 70 years old and facing the probability that I will never see you again in this life. My health is failing, and I find myself thinking more and more about the choices that have shaped our long separation. I want you to know that I have never regretted loving you, even though that love has defined my entire adult life in terms of absence. You taught me what it meant to be fully alive, fully human, fully capable of joy. That gift has sustained me through 4 decades of missing you. If you are ever able to read these words, please know that my last thoughts will be of you laughing in the palace garden, your face turned toward the sun, completely unaware that you were teaching a prince how to be a man worthy of love. I hope your life has been filled with joy. I hope your daughter has inherited your capacity for wonder, and I hope that somewhere in your heart you remember those summer evenings when the world seemed infinite with possibility. Until we meet again, Thorian. The archive room was silent except for the soft sound of weeping. Even Professor Kellner and Dr. Voss, trained to maintain professional distance from historical documents, were visibly moved by the raw emotion contained in Thorian's preserved words. Isolde held the final letter against her chest, feeling the weight of all the years they had lost to fear and misunderstanding. But alongside the grief was something unexpected, a sense of completion, of finally understanding the full scope of their story. There's one more thing, Dr. Voss said quietly, producing a small wooden box from the back of the filing cabinet. This was marked specifically for you, with instructions that it only be opened in your presence. Inside the box, nestled in faded silk, were 2 items. The first was a wedding ring, simple gold, sized for a woman's finger, with an inscription inside that read, "For my heart's home, T." The second was a small brass key. What does the key open? Ilara asked. Professor Kellner was examining it with interest. It looks like it might fit a writing desk or cabinet. There were several pieces of furniture in Prince Thorian's private quarters that remained locked after his death. The implications sent a thrill of anticipation through the room. After 40 years of secrets and silence, there might still be one final revelation waiting in the very rooms where their love story had begun. The writing desk in Thorian's private study was an elegant piece from the 18th century, its polished walnut surface bearing the subtle marks of decades of use. Isolde remembered it well. She had often sat beside it while he wrote his correspondence, sometimes reading aloud to him, or simply enjoying the comfortable silence of shared space. Dr. Voss had granted permission for them to examine the desk, though she insisted on being present along with Professor Kellner to document whatever they might discover. The brass key from the wooden box fit perfectly into a small lock hidden beneath the desktop's leather writing surface. With trembling fingers, Isolde turned the key and lifted the desktop to reveal a secret compartment beneath. Inside were several items that made her breath catch. A bundle of letters tied with ribbon, a small velvet jewelry box, and a sealed envelope marked, "For Isolde's granddaughter." He knew, Ilara whispered, staring at the envelope with her name's description. Somehow, he knew I would exist, that I might someday be here. Isolde lifted the bundle of letters first, recognizing her own handwriting on the envelopes. These were the letters she had written to him during their summer together. Thank you notes for flowers he had brought her, playful. Messages slipped under his door, formal invitations to join her for walks in the garden, written in the style of royal correspondence but filled with private jokes. He kept everything, she murmured, touched beyond words that these small tokens of their developing relationship had been preserved with such care. The jewelry box contained a matching engagement ring to complement the wedding band she now wore on her right hand. The diamond was modest by royal standards, but perfect in its simplicity, exactly the kind of ring he would have chosen for her if circumstances had been different. But it was the envelope addressed to her granddaughter that held the most significance. With Ilara's hands shaking too much to manage the delicate paper, Isolde carefully opened it and began to read aloud. To the granddaughter of my beloved Isolde, if you are reading this, it means that fate has brought my story full circle in ways I could never have imagined. I am writing this letter in 1982, knowing that I will likely never meet you, but hoping that somehow you will come to understand the love that shaped both your grandmother's life and mine. By now you may have learned that I am your biological grandfather, a relationship that brings me both joy and profound sadness. Joy because you represent the continuation of the great love of my life. Sadness because circumstances prevented me from being part of your family as I should have been. I want you to know that not a day has passed since your grandmother left Virelande that I have not thought of her with complete love and gratitude. She taught me that true nobility comes not from birthright, but from the courage to choose love over convention, compassion over duty, and truth over convenience. Your grandmother made the difficult choice to leave me because she believed it would protect us both from an impossible situation. I have spent 40 years understanding and honoring that choice, even as it broke my heart. But now I want you to know the truth she was too humble to claim. Her love transformed not just my life, but the entire future of our kingdom. Every reform I championed, every charitable foundation I established, every effort I made to move Virelande toward a more just and democratic society was inspired by the values she embodied. Her influence shaped decades of policy and countless lives, though she never knew it. I have left specific instructions with my attorneys regarding a trust fund established in your name and your mother's name. It is substantial enough to ensure your financial security and to support whatever dreams you wish to pursue. Consider it my way of providing for the family I was never able to claim publicly. But more than money, I leave you with the knowledge that you come from a line of remarkable women. Your grandmother possessed a strength and integrity that changed the course of history, even from an ocean away. Your mother, though I never met her, clearly inherited that same strength. Judging by the reports I received over the years, use that inheritance wisely. Love boldly, as your grandmother taught me to do. Choose courage over comfort, as she did when she made the hardest decision of her life. And remember that sometimes the greatest acts of love require the greatest sacrifices. If you choose to accept the trust fund, there is one condition. Use a portion of it to establish an art restoration program that will preserve the cultural heritage of Virelande for future generations. Make it a memorial to the love that was never allowed to flourish publicly, but that shaped everything beautiful that followed. With all my love and blessings, Prince Thorien Leclerc, your grandfather in heart, if not in name. The room fell silent as the implications of Thorien's final gift settled over them. He had not only preserved their love story, but had found a way to provide for the descendants he would never know, ensuring that Isolde's legacy would be woven into the very fabric of Virelande's future. Dr. Voss was the first to speak, her voice filled with wonder. This changes everything we thought we knew about Prince Thorien's motivations and his legacy, his social reforms, his charitable works. They were all love letters to a woman who had no idea of her influence. Professor Kellner was making rapid notes, his scholarly excitement barely contained. This will require a complete re-examination of our historical understanding of the period. The prince's policies take on entirely new meaning when viewed through this lens, but Isolde was focused on her granddaughter, who sat staring at the letter with tears streaming down her face. Ilara looked up at her grandmother with an expression that combined grief, wonder, and something approaching awe. "All these years you carried this alone," Ilara said softly. "You let everyone believe you were just a simple baker from South Carolina, when you were actually this, the inspiration for an entire kingdom's transformation." "I was just a young woman who fell in love," Isolde protested. "Everything else was Thorien's doing." "No," Dr. Voss interjected firmly. "That's not what the historical record shows. Prince Thorien was known for his intellectual rigor and political pragmatism before 1959. The passionate advocate for social justice, the champion of women's rights, the supporter of democratic reform, that version of him didn't exist until after his summer with you." Margaret Hartman, who had joined them for the opening of the secret compartment, nodded in agreement. "I watched the change happen. Before you arrived, the prince was dutiful but distant, focused on his obligations but lacking real passion for anything. You awakened something in him that transformed not just his personal happiness, but his entire approach to leadership. Over the following hours, as they carefully catalogued and documented every item from the secret compartment, A fuller picture emerged of the extraordinary ripple effects of their brief romance. Thorian had indeed established the trust fund mentioned in his letter, managed by a law firm in Geneva, with instructions that had awaited the appearance of Isolde's descendants for 40 years. The amount was staggering. Invested wisely over 4 decades, it had grown into a sum that would indeed ensure financial security for generations. But more than the money was the recognition it represented. Thorian's determination that their love should benefit the world, even if it could never be publicly acknowledged. "There's something else," Margaret said, as they prepared to seal the documents for proper archival preservation. "Something I never told anyone, not even in my dearest confidence." She had been carrying a small wrapped package, which she now placed on the desk beside the other discoveries. "The night before Prince Thorian died, he called for me. He was very weak, but he pressed this into my hands and made me promise to give it to Isolde if she ever returned to Virlande. He said it was the most important thing he owned, and he couldn't bear the thought of it being lost to history." Isolde unwrapped the package with reverent care, revealing a small leather-bound journal with her name embossed on the cover, not the one she had given him as a gift, but another, filled entirely with his handwriting. The first page bore a simple inscription: "Every day with you and every day without you. A record of the heart." 1959-1983. As she opened it and began to read, Isolde realized she was holding Thorian's complete emotional record of their relationship and its aftermath. Daily entries that chronicled not just his love for her, but his gradual understanding of why she had left, and his determination to honor her choice while keeping their love alive in his own heart. It was the ultimate love letter, written over 24 years, a testament to the enduring power of a connection that had survived separation, silence and time itself. As the sun set over Virlande, casting golden light through the windows of the room where their story had begun, 4 people sat surrounded by the evidence of one of history's most private love stories. But it was no longer private. It was finally complete, with all its beauty, tragedy, and ultimate triumph preserved for posterity. Isolde closed the journal and looked around at the faces of those who had helped her uncover this final chapter. Tomorrow, there would be decisions to make about the trust fund, about the restoration program Thorian had envisioned, about how to honor a love that had shaped a kingdom from the shadows. But tonight, she simply wanted to sit in this room where she had been happiest, surrounded by proof that love, real, transformative, sacrificial love, never truly dies. It simply transforms, becoming the foundation for everything beautiful that follows. 6 months later, Isolde stood in the palace gardens as the first roses of spring began to bloom, their fragrance carried on the same gentle breeze that had enchanted her 44 years earlier. The restoration work was complete, both Ilara's meticulous conservation of the royal portraits and the deeper restoration of truth that had transformed their understanding of the past. The Thorian Leclerc Memorial Art Restoration Center would officially open next month, funded by the trust he had established and managed by Ilara, who had accepted the position as its first director. The program would train young conservators from around the world, ensuring that cultural heritage would be preserved for future generations while providing opportunities for artists who might otherwise lack access to such specialized training. "The portrait looks magnificent," Dr. Voss said, joining Isolde beneath the old oak tree where she and Thorian had often shared afternoon conversations. "Miss Marlowe's work has revealed details that were hidden for decades. The prince's expression is so much more vivid now. You can see the kindness in his eyes, the intelligence, the hint of melancholy that suggests a deeper story." Isolde smiled, though her eyes remained fixed on the garden path where 2 young people were walking together. Ilara and Oliver had grown close during the months of revelations and restorations, their shared fascination with history and their families' intertwined stories creating a bond that seemed to deepen with each passing week. "Do you think they know they're falling in love?" Margaret asked, appearing beside them with the careful steps of her 86 years, but with eyes that missed nothing. "I think they're still figuring it out," Isolde replied. "But there's something beautiful about watching love develop naturally, without the complications of hidden identities and impossible circumstances." The past months had brought extraordinary changes to all their lives. The public revelation of Prince Thorian's love story had captivated not just Virlande but much of Europe. transforming him from a respected but mysterious historical figure into a romantic icon whose love had literally shaped a kingdom's future. Isolde had initially been hesitant about making their story public, but she had come to understand that it belonged to history now, not just to her. More importantly, the full truth had finally allowed her to make peace with the choices she had made as a young woman. "I received a letter from Sarah's daughter yesterday," she told Margaret, referring to her other granddaughter back in South Carolina. "She's planning to visit this summer to see where her grandmother's story began. She wants to understand her family's history." The revelation of Sarah's true parentage had been handled carefully within the family, but it had brought unexpected healing. Isolde's daughter-in-law had always wondered about certain traits in her children that seemed to come from nowhere: their artistic abilities, their love of history, their natural empathy for social causes. Now she understood they were inheritances from a grandfather they had never known, but whose values had shaped their family legacy. "The memorial service will be beautiful," Dr. Voss said, changing the subject to the ceremony planned for the anniversary of Thorian's death. "Having you there to represent the love that inspired his greatest achievements will make it complete." Isolde nodded, though she still felt overwhelmed by the idea of being publicly recognized as the mysterious love who had changed a prince's life. She had spent so many years as simply the widow who ran Sweet Grove Bakery that this transformation into a historical figure felt surreal, but she had also found unexpected peace in finally understanding the full scope of their story. Thorian's journals, which she had been reading slowly over the months, revealed a man who had indeed been hurt by her departure, but who had chosen to transform that pain into something constructive. His love for her had never diminished, but it had evolved into a commitment to making the world better in ways that reflected the values she had embodied. "I need to tell you something," Margaret said suddenly, her voice carrying the weight of years. "Something I've been carrying for too long." Isolde turned to face her old friend, recognizing the tone of someone preparing to make a difficult confession. "The night before you left Virelande, back in 1959, Margaret continued, "Prince Thorian came to find me. He was planning to tell you the truth about his identity the next day. He had decided to confess everything and ask you to marry him, regardless of the political complications." The revelation hit Isolde like a physical blow. "He was going to propose? He had the ring, the one you found in his desk. He was terrified that his deception would hurt you, but he couldn't bear to let you leave without knowing how much he loved you and wanted to build a life together." Margaret's voice trembled. "If you hadn't left that morning, everything would have been different." Isolde sank onto the garden bench beside the path, overwhelmed by this final piece of their story. All these years, she had convinced herself that she had saved them both from an impossible situation, when in fact she had fled just hours before he would have chosen her over everything else. "How do you live with knowledge like that?" she asked quietly. "The same way you lived with your choices," Margaret replied, gently. "By understanding that we all did what we thought was right with the information we had at the time. You couldn't have known what he was planning, just as I couldn't have known that my interference years later would prevent you from reconnecting, when you both might have been ready." Dr. Voss, who had been listening with the respectful attention of someone trained to handle historical revelations, spoke up thoughtfully. "Perhaps that's the most important lesson of your story. Not the tragedy of missed opportunities, but the extraordinary good that can come from love, even when circumstances prevent it from following traditional paths." She gestured toward the restoration center that was taking shape in one wing of the palace, toward Ilara and Oliver, whose own love story was beginning to unfold, toward the gardens that had been renovated using funds from Thorian's charitable foundations. "Prince Thorian's love for you transformed an entire kingdom's approach to social justice, women's rights, and democratic reform. Your decision to raise his daughter with dignity and strength created a legacy that brought her granddaughter back here to preserve cultural heritage for future generations." Even Margaret's well-intentioned interference led to decades of charitable work that improved countless lives. As if summoned by their conversation, Ilara approached with Oliver, both of them glowing with the happiness of young people who had discovered they were perfectly matched. They had spent the morning reviewing plans for the Restoration Center's opening celebration, their professional partnership deepening into something more personal with each shared project. "Grandma," Ilara said, settling beside Isolde on the bench, "Oliver and I have been talking about the memorial service. We think there should be a reading from grandfather's journals, something that shows how his love for you inspired his greatest achievements. The easy way she referred to Thorian as her grandfather still amazed Isolde. Ilara had embraced this newly discovered heritage with enthusiasm, incorporating it into her identity without diminishing the love she felt for Robert, who had raised her mother with devoted care. I think that would be appropriate, Isolde agreed. He would have liked knowing that his private thoughts could finally serve a public good. As the afternoon sun began to slant through the trees, casting the same golden light that had illuminated their first meeting decades earlier, Isolde felt a profound sense of completion. The story that had begun in confusion and secrecy had finally found its proper ending. Not in personal happiness for her and Thorian, which had been lost to time and circumstance, but in the continuation of love through new generations and transformed lives. The garden around them bore witness to enduring truths. Love planted in good soil will always bear fruit, even if that fruit ripens in unexpected seasons. Choices made with courage and sacrifice create legacies that outlast the people who make them. And sometimes the greatest love stories are not about two people finding their way to each other, but about the beautiful things that grow from love shared generously with the world. As evening approached and the others began to drift back toward the palace, Isolde remained on the bench where she had spent so many precious hours with Thorian all those years ago. The roses he had planted for her were blooming again, their fragrance a bridge between past and present, between what was lost and what endured. Tomorrow would bring new responsibilities, the memorial service to plan, the restoration center to launch, the ongoing work of honoring a love that had changed the world in quiet, persistent ways. But tonight, she simply wanted to sit in this place where it all began, surrounded by the evidence that some loves are too powerful to be contained by time or silence, too transformative to be diminished by separation or death. In the end, perhaps that was the most important truth of all. Real love never really ends. It simply becomes part of everything beautiful that follows, growing like roses in a garden that remembers every season of joy and sorrow, every moment of connection that transforms ordinary hearts into something worthy of eternity. My friends, we've come to the end of the story. Did you like it? What lesson can you bring to life from this story? Leave it here in the comments. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and watch this video that's playing on your screen. This story will impact you. See you next time.